Hi, I'm Em,
And my name is Bea.
and this is
Fangirls
Fangirls
Anonymous.
Anonymous.
A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Hi, Bea, how's it going?
It is going fantastic, Em. Do you know why?
Why?
Because we're recording again!
We're actually doing the thing again. Isn't that exciting?
Mhm.
Oh, man.
I'm very excited. It has been too long.
So long. Life became really crazy.
Mm-hmm.
We're not sorry for not putting out stuff, but we're happy to start putting out stuff again. Let's put it that way. And season 4 is going to be so much fun. We have a lot of ideas, and we actually now have the energy wherewithal to do it, which is super cool. But yeah, how have you been, Bea?
Ever getting busier. Fun fact, kids, as you become more and more adult-like, evolve into your final form, whatever it is, you stop having time to do things. It's great.
But also, you are allowed to focus on the things you want to do, so it's really a give and take, honestly.
Yeah.
But speaking of things we want to do, this show could not go on without your support on Patreon. Thank you guys to everybody who has continued to support us on there. If you want to support us, not through Patreon, but through a review, go ahead and review us somewhere. We really appreciate it. It's super fun hearing about people's thoughts and opinions. We also have a fic club happening still, but we've decided that instead of doing multiple fic club episodes throughout the season, we kind of just want to focus on one like grouping of fics and have you guys give you guys lots of time to read it and then send us stuff. So we'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's gonna be really fun. But we did get a fun email today as we're recording this. We haven't recorded in a very long time, as you guys know. And yet, the day we decide to start recording for season 4, we get an email from somebody talking about RPF. It's from a person named Lou. Thank you so much, Lou, for emailing us. Basically, in our RPF episode, we asked people to email us talking about why they like or liked RPF, and because we just didn't really understand it as people who didn't really read or get into RPF at all. And they talk about how when they were young, they really loved the One Direction fandom. They were super into Larry Stylinson. And eventually they realized that maybe it wasn't the thing that they were super into anymore. And I think that this paragraph describes it well. Now that I'm slightly older, I can see how RPF can be problematic, and I don't really engage with it anymore. But I also think that RPF can be fun in games, and that people can enjoy it without taking it to the extremes that Larry fans did, and keeping it respectful. And most RPF ships don't get out of hand the way Larry did. I think that shipping real people is not a crime, and creating fan content is all well and good, but shoving your ship into the faces of your idols is definitely wrong. Thank you, Lou, for emailing us about your opinions. It's just interesting to get some insight into somebody else's experience as an RPF shipper.
Yeah, we really, really do value our listeners who reach out to us to explain some of their experiences that we don't necessarily share because fandom is a big place. There are a lot of different kinds of people. We cannot possibly cover every conceivable angle or experience. So thank you so much for reaching out.
Yes, thank you so much, Lou. So, welcome to season 4. And we thought to start off season 4, we could do a fun little episode on your name fic, specifically the relationship between character and audience, and how that can kind of become in itself a romance or a ship. I guess it could be considered a ship, which is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting thought. So yeah, we have some thoughts about it, even though this is also a thing in which we don't necessarily read. This is also something in fandom that we aren't super into, but we think it's important to talk about this because it is a subset of this whole concept of, I don't know, the extremes of fan fiction.
It's a sub-community. It's a sub-community
Yeah.
within the bigger community that engages in this particular kind of fandom experience, which, again, not a whole lot of experience, but we're willing to dive in and see what it's about, because
Yeah.
would it really be fandom without this?
No, no, it would not. And I don't mean extremes as in like it's a bad thing or anything. I mean like the fringes. The fringes
Mhm,
of the land that is the fandom, the kingdom that is being in fan fiction. Let's get into it a little bit.
mhm,
So it's also so it's called YN because Y and N means your name, but it's also called reader insert fic, where it's when the writer uses some type of, you know, word to indicate that you should put yourself into that
mhm,
particular position within the story,
mhm.
which you don't find a whole lot outside of fandom.
No, like if you tried to reach out to a publisher and we're like, so I'm gonna write a story. I'm like, okay, yeah, story, good. That's what we do here. And they went, but get this, the main character is the reader. They would have questions. The first one probably being like, do you mean a choose your own adventure novel? And if you went, no, no,
Yeah.
no, 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 you don't choose anything. It's still just a story. But like, we're gonna have the reader be the character. They'd start scratching their heads because they'd be like, do you want to make a video game? The answer is no, no, it's a book, a novel. They would not necessarily go for that.
Honestly, Reader Inserfic is closer to a video game than it is to anything else besides a novel or a story. I didn't think of it that way until now. What is the history of this particular subgenre of fanfiction be?
So I'm going to preface this by warning everybody that, as with many things in fandom history, things are murky. So I'm going to say some things that are going to have a whole lot of implied caveats, specifically when it comes to dates, because I really highly doubt that the things that we have really solid dates for are actually first of kind. It They're a little bit too ubiquitous to fandom in general, at least these days, for me to believe that people didn't write them in the ye old golden days of, say, Star Trek the original series. Now, whether or not we have any really excellent surviving examples, or whether or not what might have started out as reader insert sort of got morphed in publication to something that looks more like a Mary Sue or an OC, that is hard to say. But for the sake of what we can actually pin a date to, some of the very, very first examples of reader insert fic that you will find come from 1999 with, you'll never guess what fandom, it's Star Trek. It's Star Trek who begins all things apparently in fandom. And if that sounds kind of weirdly late to the game, it seems that way to me too. 99 is solidly an early internet fandom era, and that might have something to do with it, at least why we can pin a date to it. But things really got rolling in terms of popularity of this particular kind of fic through the early 2000s. You started seeing it on fanfiction.net, and there's some really interesting history that I'm going to get into regarding Quizilla, which, if you don't know what that is, you're in good company. I didn't know what that was either, what it had to do with fan fiction. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the thing is, if it kind of became popular in 2000, it also got banned pretty quickly because there was the 2005 fanfiction.net ban very specifically called out reader inserts and choose your own adventure style stories. They were not allowed anymore, which is interesting because instead of there being a dearth thereof, it seems like they just sort of drifted around for a while. Interestingly, DeviantArt had a really big community, especially in Asian media fandom spaces. That also got banned because they had some concerns about both user and character ages in when people were writing, say, smut. So that they kind of got booted off there as well. Then we got AO3, and as we know, AO3 believes strongly in people being allowed to do kind of within reason what they want. And then, of course, there is Tumblr. And Tumblr is interesting because you can definitely find ficlets and fics that are reader insert on Tumblr, but you also had the rise of something which are called imagines, which had a strong culture of reader insert. We'll come back and talk about those as well because they are a little bit more of an umbrella term, so it's worth touching on, but it's a little bit outside the scope of this episode.
I can't remember. Did LiveJournal when the death of LiveJournal happened? Was that one of the cuts? Reader insert fix.
Do not believe so.
Okay.
Uh, Interestingly enough,
Yeah.
LiveJournal, because it was a blogging site, kind of like Tumblr, I feel like since it was to a certain extent communities were self-moderated, it wasn't the same kind of a big deal. Or it was a big deal in a different way because you would find a community that did or didn't like it. Quizilla is, as you might guess from the name, a quiz site, or it was. I do not believe it exists anymore. If it doesn't, it's in a much reduced form. It its original intention was to put together what we would probably think of as more like BuzzFeed style quizzes now. What Hogwarts house are you in? What does your favorite book say about what type of cookies you like? You could put together kind of a however you wanted quiz. So, for some reason that may or may not be related to it, the choose your own adventure and reader insert being banned from fanfiction.net, people decided that they really liked making fic that you would read while doing the quizzes. Now, having not been on the site, I've had a little bit of trouble conceptualizing this, but from what I understand, the quizzes, like your standard quiz, would have enough room for a couple of lines of text for your question, quote unquote. And then you could choose a response. Now, the way some of these quizzes work is they were choose your own adventure. So you would have a couple of lines of text and then you would choose what happened next, and they would have some branching options to do your story. But some of them were really, there was really no choose option. It was, you may or may not have multiple options, but whatever you clicked, it would just advance the story as per whatever the author wanted. The caveat being that you really only had a couple of lines of text to be able to do this. So you would be going, and as far as I know, there really wasn't a cap on the number of questions in a quiz. So you could have not horrendously long, but decently long fics, a couple thousand words, that you would have to click through these couple of sentences over and over and over again to read. And apparently, reader insert was a popular genre in this format. Even to this day, I sort of can't conceptualize how that would work because that sounds, for somebody who regularly goes to AO3 and says all the chapters is one, the idea of going through that many pages is wild to me.
Pretty wild. I mean, like, how much time do you have on your hands? Kind of situation.
And on the other hand, though, I could see why it could kind of suck you in, I guess,
Yeah.
in the same way that, like, some of the our platforms now that have really quick bite-sized pieces like TikTok or Vine used to, or even Instagram,
Yeah.
where you have stories that are here and gone. Like, the story would be like a couple of sentences. Okay, just another couple of sentences, just another couple of sentences, and then suddenly you're on question 300 and you have no idea how you got there.
Humans will do anything with anything to make a story, and I love that.
Hmm.
It kind of reminds me of the DS like Picto chats.
Ah.
People making people making stories or animations out of those. Fascinating stuff, honestly.
Mhm.
People do anything. People do anything with anything to make a story.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it n- a little bit of an aside, but I felt like it was worth noting that Reader Insert has a deep history involving a little site called
Called
Quizilla that,
Quizilla.
depending on how old you are, you may never have heard of.
I think I went on Quizilla a couple of times when I was like 9
I
and
had
took a few quizzes.
Were any of them actually fic in disguise?
No, they were not. I don't think so. They were like, what your favorite color says about you or something, you know?
Which is the sort of thing that you would think would be on the
Yeah.
site. So
Very BuzzFeed esque.
yeah, it's sort of like digging into a site that you think is one thing and then suddenly discovering that it's something else entirely. It's just
Yeah.
wild.
So funny. Other names that we can that you could use to describe reader insert is self insert, which have I seen anything that isn't necessarily specifically reader insert, but it's called self insert and it's different than reader insert? Have I seen that?
I don't
I don't know.
know. It feels like a square rectangle argument that
Yeah,
all reader insert is self insert, but not all self or
insert is reader insert.
yeah,
Yeah,
because and the only real difference is I think sometimes there's a half step of distance if it is reader rather than self. So it's an I versus a you thing. I think self insert can be I or you for your pronoun choice, but reader is
yeah.
almost always you.
Also, sometimes people use the term self insert in their tags wherever they're putting their fan fiction as a way to describe basically writing an OC, but it is truly them reacting to the characters. Sometimes that is a thing I've seen. I saw that specifically in a Good Omens fic.
Yeah, and there's variants on these, which it's worth talking about the nuance because what we're talking about right now in this episode is where the character is actually part of the story in media res. Like, um, that is the wrong Latin phrase I'm looking for. Um, for those of you who know what that means, you just sort of gave me a blank look.
In media res is when it's called when basically it means the story is starting in the middle of action. That's what in media
Yes,
res means.
I think the I'm looking for the phrase in situ.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
in the middle of it is they are in the story. There's nothing meta about it. They're just a character. Whereas you can do self insert that can be on a sliding scale of meta from this is a character who I see strong reflections of myself in, but they are still technically just a character. So for Tolkien fans, Tom Bombadil. For non Tolkien fans, I don't have a great example off the top of my head. For maybe some Marvel fans, the other end of that meta is a Stan Lee cameo, where it's 100% meta. You're supposed to know
Yes.
that that's Stan Lee. The characters don't even have names. But technically, he is just a character in the story. Knowing that it is a reference, well, it makes it more fun, isn't necessary. On the other hand, there's even one step further back where you don't see this as often, but in older fan fiction, specifically on fanfiction.net, you would sometimes have the author literally show up in the story to commentate, to make characters do things. Sometimes it was in the end note, sometimes it was literally in the middle of the story. They would have a break where the author would be interacting with the characters and then go back to the story as though that never happened. Sort of if in a manga, sometimes mangaka will add extra pages off the end of a volume where they have cute little funny comic pages where the mangaka has a character for themselves that interact with the story or are just being a mangaka. It's sort of like that, where they were a character that is completely meta. They're in here to break the fourth wall. It's not really as much what we're talking about with this because I think that one is primarily for humor. I've never seen that one tried to be played straight.
It will happen though. If it can happen, it will.
I'm sure someone somewhere will make the most ridiculous psychological metafiction involving themselves somehow. Yes.
Yes.
So I feel like that was a lot of words to explain, which is ultimately a pretty simple concept.
Yeah. It's basically it's on the tin, essentially what reader insert fic is.
Hmm.
When you know what it is, you know what it is. It's not like a super complicated idea.
Hmm.
It's when an author asks you to be part of the story as a character, way more so than any other type of fan fiction, I
Hmm.
would say. And now we're kind of into our opinions.
Hmm.
So, some pros. We always like to talk about the pros first. It's an alternative for people who don't like OCs. Either the author doesn't like writing them or the people in that particular fandom don't like reading OCs, which I think that there are certain fandoms that don't like OCs.
I feel like some people in general don't like them.
That's true. Yeah.
I will admit that my mileage varies wildly on what I think of OCs. Sometimes I
Same.
love them, sometimes I hate them, and when I hate them, it tends to be because I feel like there's something either really jarring about their presence in the story, or it feels
Hmm.
like they're there to incite drama that doesn't otherwise naturally exist.
Or like they're literally just not needed, and you just wanted to put your friend in a fic.
Mhm. Yeah, again,
Like that
jarring,
happens.
something that doesn't
Yeah.
mesh at
Yeah.
all. So I can see how some people would be very turned off by the idea in general. Like, I don't want you to make up people to put in this in my made up story. I would rather have something that's a little bit, I guess, more fluid in how you interpret them, which
Hmm.
reader insert can be like that, where due to the way you have to write it, sometimes there's a neutrality to the action because you have to appeal or make people believe that this could happen, which is harder to do when you haven't actually met your audience, you know? We can talk about that more in a minute. I have some things to say about that.
Okay. Um, it's also an instant, for some people, emotional connection, um, sort of like the first person POV.
Hmm. Which the way I think of this particular sort of sus- immediate suspension of disbelief, it is. I read a book a while ago called "If on a Winter's Night a Traveler" by Italo Calvino, and he has this amazing quote in the opening chapter, which is about a character who you don't ever learn the name of, and it's all from first person point of view. And the character is sort of meditating on himself to a certain extent. And one of the things that this character says is he's thinking about why you, the reader, connect with him. And what he says is, "This is simply because I am called I, and this is the only thing you know about me. But this alone is enough for you to invest a part of yourself in the stranger I." So
Hmm.
having a story in which the character who is supposed to be you uses the pronoun I, your brain is immediately processing that it's you and you believe that. So it there is this sort of instant synergy on the page that is really hard to get around. It's why first person can be absolutely jaw-droppingly amazing when you do it right, and very frustrating when it isn't done right.
It's also a ultimate form of wish fulfillment. So if it's a story about you as the insert character having a relationship with a character that you find attractive, that is a form of wish fulfillment. If it's about you being inserted into the story as a character on an adventure, that is wish fulfillment.
If you've ever been really frustrated by the way things went and you're just like, I'm gonna fix it, and you appear in the story to fix it, wish
That's
fulfillment.
wish fulfillment. Yeah. Uh, like it is. We'll talk about this later, but it is dependent on how the author wants the story to go because it's not like you're actually making any decisions. You're really along for the ride, like you are with any other story. But if you completely agree with how the author would make you as a character do certain things, then it's like totally like you. I've heard it can be euphoric because you're like, holy shit, finally, like I'm changing how things are happening, or I get to go on this adventure, or I get to kiss this guy or girl or whoever. Um, and it's fun for a lot of people, I would say, because people write it all the time, but
Hmm.
maybe not for a number of people, but it is an the ultimate form or an ultimate form of wish fulfillment by inserting yourself into a story that you wish to be a part of.
Hmm.
And then another way to express experience is at a distance. In quotes here, or in parentheses, it says more therapy for the author and for the reader. Therapy. Therapy. It's interesting.
Uh, s- More or less, the thought process behind that is anybody who is a writer knows that whether you mean
Hmm.
to or not, you do put pieces of yourself out there when you're writing. But when you're doing a reader insert, especially if it's something you're not necessarily writing to an audience, but you're writing for you because you wanted this, which I feel like a lot of it is because although the reader is technically the character, the writer who is writing it is the person expressing who that character is. So it sort of ultimately makes the reader the writer, which sounds very confusing, but your author is at its heart this character. And so by having it in this weird middle distance where it's not a completely separate character, but it's not you writing about yourself, you can kind of you can express ideas in a way you wouldn't necessarily be comfortable with if you were actually writing about yourself, but it feels closer and more intimate than if you were writing about someone else entirely. And I feel like this can be really cathartic for some people, the way that in a different way than just regular fiction, because you are directly, obviously, explicitly making yourself a piece of it. All writing is parts of you, both what the writer puts in and what the reader gets out. It's all pieces of who's interacting with the text. But this is so there's no pretense about it. And there's something kind of freeing about that, I think, for some people, that they're like, yeah, I really am projecting. I that is what is happening here. Um
There's
and
no
it's
ifs, and
great.
or buts about that.
Mhm. And so I think it can be really cathartic for some people. In a weird way, I feel like this has some connection with RPF because that also lives in this weird middle zone where
Yeah.
it's not you writing about yourself, nor is it a completely fictional made up person. It's somewhere in between.
RPF is real person fic.
Yes. So I feel like both of those kind of play in this gray zone where the pretenses are more obvious.
Yeah.
Like they're not they're not hiding behind a mask of this is just fictional and there's nothing about it that this author doesn't exist. Like the author does exist and they're here and they have thoughts and emotions and needs and they're just going to put them there on the page for you.
Hmm. Okay, so those are some of the pros, and here are some of the cons. Obviously, all of these pros and cons are nuanced. They're not necessarily like exactly pro and con, but this is just how we grouped these. Uh, Second person point of view
Mhm.
in part of the cons. What do you mean by that, B?
So, for those of you who have read, not necessarily reader insert, although this does fall in that category, if you've read second person point of view, if you've written second person point of view, you will understand that it is a really strange point of view to write and to read in. It can be really frustrating to do
Mm,
because it is not in English it is not natural to assign people that level of distance.
yeah.
And also in English, due to the way grammar works, it comes across as imperative a lot because in English, oftentimes, if not exclusively, when you are addressing someone as you or basic sentence structure, you, action, whatever, I walk along, I'm doing the thing, obviously. You walk along, I'm telling you to do it. It can come across as kind of stilted and odd that for that reason. A lot of people don't care for that.
There is a really good book that I read growing up called "You Don't Know Me" by David Class. I read in middle school, and it's very good. If you want to read a book with large swaths of it in a second person point of view, I recommend that one. The main character is going through a rough time, and he talks at people in his head in second POV, and it's so different from most YA novels. This is truly a YA novel. He's in high school, and it's very sad but very good. So that's the only instance I've read. The only in all of the books and the fan fiction I have read, the only time I have found a really good example of second person POV is that book.
Mhm.
But in a lot of instances, like you're talking about, B, it's not. It just doesn't work because
Mhm.
of how our language works. I would say,
Yeah. And
yeah.
that's why it is in the con column because it is off-putting for a lot of people due to the way that reader insert self-insert works. That is the most natural way to get around the pronoun issue unless you're doing it directly from first person. A lot of the other workarounds are clunkier. A lot of your name will just skip the pronoun entirely and just put a lot of y/in over and over and over again, in, which doesn't
Which
really help things.
Ugh, I hate that so much.
Yeah, pronouns exist for a reason in English. They're great.
Yeah,
Use them.
yeah, yeah. For some reason, I don't know why, but a lot of young authors are, or writers, are like attracted to doing this type of fic, doing YN fic. And that can mean that sometimes there is juvenile plotting involved or juvenile character work.
Which isn't a bad thing. It's a learning curve.
No,
It
no,
just
yeah, it's not a bad thing.
you should adjust your expectations
And
accordingly.
also, there are plenty of young readers who like that kind of thing because, like, that it works with their how their brains work too because they're young. But I don't know why that this particular type of style attracts young writers.
If I had to take a stab in the dark, and this is even more purely my opinion than any of the rest of this my opinion has been, I would argue that it's the lack of pretension. There's something really seductive as a writer about saying,
Lack.
you know what, I'm just gonna put it all out there and however it works out, it works out. It'll be easy. I'll just slap the words on the page. Because as a writer, one of those things that is really hard to do is to ask yourself, what would the character do? Especially in fic writing, where the characters are somebody else's creation, even if that somebody else is a collective, the fandom in general, a fanon interpretation. So you're still sort of, all of it is still ultimately your decision, but you are trying to line it up at least a little bit, recognizably this character. Whereas in your name, it it's you. You can ask yourself, what would I do in this situation? And that makes it seem like it's a lot easier. It isn't a lot of the time, though, gotta be honest. It's sort of like writing in first person. First person is so fun to write the first couple of times you do it. And then you start trying to edit it, and you realize how hard it is to do well. So, for what it's worth, I think that it's because it seems on the surface to be much simpler, but then when it comes time to actually like really polish it and make it good, it's really hard to get it there, that last little bit. Going back to the whole the pronoun thing, the second person, the putting reader or I or your name in it, it again can be a little clunky when you get used to it. And also back to the imperative thing where it feels sometimes like you're being told you would do this. A lot of times when it's really romance focused, as somebody on the A spectrum, no, I would not like that. No, I'm not going to do that. In fact, that's the opposite. Thank you. It's really jarring and gets rid of my suspension of disbelief pretty instantly when I'm like, nope, hold up. Nope, that's not, mm-mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As an American, as an American, this is very much correct. Like, I feel like Americans would agree with this next point. People don't like being told what to do. It says the distance between what they would do and what happens pulls them out of the story, which is what I was talking about earlier.
Mhm,
The author has to write exactly how you would do the thing because they have inserted you into it. So, like, of course, if the character of you doesn't do the thing you would do, that takes you out of the story. And that makes it infinitely more difficult. The stories have to therefore be more simple because,
mhm,
like, otherwise you're just going to take everybody out if it's an incredibly complicated story and there are so many instances in which you could have done something different, you know. So it
mhm.
tends to be more romance oriented because in romance there's only so many options compared to like a grand adventure, you know.
Or
um,
the other two options are, and this may be another factor in maybe some of the younger writing style,
mhm, mhm.
is you have to make a really, really flat
Yeah.
binary of choices where you're you have it set up so that either you're going to murder puppies or you're going to give $1 million to a children's hospital. Well, of course you're going to give $1 million to the children's hospital. Like, why is that a question? It's a really obvious choice, which cuts all of the nuance out of the narrative in a lot of ways.
In a lot of instances you either make it a good story or you make it believable for this particular
Hmm.
iteration of story. And then also, it is just to continue on with this concept, very dependent on the author's worldview and preferences. So, in a lot of instances, the thing you would do maybe does not coincide with the value or with the world view of the author themselves. So they wouldn't have even thought to do the thing you would do.
Hmm. Which is where the lack of pretension comes back around to bite you,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because it's pretty clear that despite the audience technically being the character, it's really the writer who's the character. So the writer is writing what they would do, which, if you are really different than your audience, is going to be alienating. Now, if you happen to just be sending it to a close group of friends and you all have pretty similar views and agree on things, it's going to be really immersive. You're going to be like, of course, that's what you would do, or I would do.
I just got a fantastic text from our friend MissSampo, who is listening in, and says she says we call that Mass Effect morality. Perfect.
I mean, to be fair, the other option, the third only other option I can think of, the third option when it comes to these stories of either writing something that, yeah, it's romance, where of course you want them to get together, that's the point of the story, or the choices are really kind of comically obvious, is again the choose your own adventure stories.
Yeah.
But those are really complicated to try and write depending on the platform,
Hmm.
and also a lot more effort for the writer in some ways because you have to write essentially however many branching storylines until it's done.
8 or 16 or 32 different endings and all of the beforeness of that too, which is insane. But yeah, those are some of the cons. A pro could be that you just like it, and a con could be that you just don't like it. Like that's also a thing. It just depends on what you enjoy, and also I would argue your line of believability, your line of being able to like not care about certain things.
Or just go with the flow because I feel like a
Yeah,
lot of people who read self insert or reader insert are not looking for high literature. They're looking for uh,
the vibe
they're
of that
looking for the
fic.
theater popcorn
Yeah.
of fic, where you go, you eat it. It doesn't have to be great. It just has to be there in your hand while you're enjoying yourself. And when you're done, you're done. There's no real nutritional value to it.
Action movie, driving movies. It's a driving movie.
Or cotton candy. Like
Yeah.
it's it's not really filling in terms of literature. It's just tasty, you know? So they don't necessarily want anything that's it's not they don't want something that's going to change their life necessarily. They want something that you can consume and enjoy and be done with repeatedly.
And I think that there is a large audience for that.
Hmm.
But what is the line between a real person fic and, oh, sorry, not a real person fic, a reader insert fic and certain other types of characters of which we have listed
Hmm.
out? So there are OCs, which is original character. I guess you could say that putting somebody else into the fic without it being in a second person point of view isn't isn't necessarily that, but it also kind of is, I guess.
It also begs the question, like we were talking about, if the writer is so far removed from their audience that it no longer feels like them, does that just default it back to
Yeah,
being a really strangely named OC?
yeah,
Like, if
it could
if
be.
you're different enough,
It literally could be though, which is fun. That's
and
fun to talk about. It's fun to think about.
oh yeah, like where it almost feels like a spectrum from like it's definitely 100% the author or reader all the way to this is clearly a different character entirely. And there's this lovely gray zone in the middle where you're like, what are they? Do they have a name?
Probably, probably not. I guess. I mean, you could put. Honestly, when you're reading those fics, you could just like create your own name of a character, and it wouldn't be that different than a regular fic.
Depending on where it falls in your moral compass,
Yeah,
there's a reason why you couldn't go through and replace every instance of your name with an actual name. You could say,
yeah.
I have decided that your name is named Stella, and Stella is going to be in every story instead of your name, and that's how I'm going to read it. Like,
Yeah,
I mean,
you could.
you could.
Yeah. And then there are Mary Sue's and Marty Sue's stews, sorry, Marty Stews, where the character is seemingly, we're going to talk about Mary Sue eventually. We've promised this for like 2 years at this point, but we will. The character is essentially like so good at what they do without seemingly having to have worked at it that it's unbelievable. Uh and that's getting on the periphery of even talking about reader insert fic. But a lot of times people accuse the author of just self-inserting themselves,
Mm.
but with a different name.
I mean, it is worth examining.
Yeah.
Can something that is explicitly reader insert also be Mary Sue Marty Stew? I mean, I don't see why. There's a connection there, which is really interesting because if you are gonna go in and fix the story and everybody's gonna be thankful for it and you're gonna get your character that you like, wouldn't that be a Mary Sue or Marty Stew?
Sure.
But at the same time, they're not actually their own character going in and doing all of these objects. So again, gray zone. Where do they
Huge gray
fit?
zone. And then there are the bicycles. For example,
Mm.
Darcy Lewis from the Marvel series, from the Marvel fandom.
Which, for those of you not hip to the lingo, um, a bicycle is a term which refers to a character who usually gets passed around in ships. The phrase is everybody gets a ride. So they get shipped with everybody in the franchise and outside of the franchise.
I think Alucard is from Castlevania is also a character like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't know if you should talk about them in the same conversation as reader insert fic necessarily, because they just happen to be a character that can be, seemingly has chemistry with anyone and can have chemistry with any character, right?
So the reason it's worth talking about, in my opinion,
Okay.
is a lot of bicycles are
Hmm.
bicycles because they end up being sort of an every person. Not
Oh,
necessarily
interesting.
value card, but Darcy Lewis in particular, part of the reason she was a bicycle is because she's, I believe, had something like maybe 4 hours total screen time in the entire MCU. And most of what you
Hmm.
know about her are things like her iPod got stolen and she was upset about it.
And she likes Pop
And
Tarts,
that
I
she
think.
stuck around and she was a poli-sci major. Like you don't know a lot about her. But her actress had big presence. So people are like, we like her. We like this character, but we don't know anything about them. So we're going to make it up and it can kind of be made to fit. So there comes a point when you kind of ask yourself, at what point do you take, say, a fandom bicycle character and say, okay, we really don't know anything, so I'm going to kind of make them the way I want to do them, which is kind of the way I would do things, which sort of slowly morphs into self insert by a different name.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be.
Uh,
Interesting.
Much like RPF, neither M nor I really reads this, unless in case that wasn't blatantly obvious by this
Well,
point.
okay. I have to say, I think that the very first fic I ever read was coming across a reader insert fic, and it wasn't YN as the moniker for the reader. It was just you. No, it was reader. It was like reader then does this, and it was about Loki taking care of you, the reader. And I remember reading and thinking, is this what fan fiction is? Because I just randomly came across it on Tumblr. I'm so happy I did not let that particular dislike of that story stop me. I did finish it because it was like, oh, he's being sweet, but I don't really believe in Loki's characterization in this because I had just watched the 2012 Avengers film. But like, it was an interesting look into fan fiction at that point.
And to be fair, I do encounter it in the wild. I don't, interestingly on Tumblr, as
Yeah, it's
ficlets a
almost
lot.
always on
And
Tumblr.
not to like call anyone out, but the amount of times it is X particular male character in a franchise taking care
Mm-hmm.
of the
Mm-hmm.
reader
Mm-hmm.
is actually kind of sickening, to be honest with you, because I'm so sorry, guys, that your life is not filled with like men that are nice to you. That is your ultimate wish fulfillment is you want a man to be nice and
That's so
care about
funny.
you?
That's so sad. Oh fuck. Not to be mean to anybody who reads it. Oh, oh.
I'm
Get you a
just
man who is better
yeah.
than the fictional men you read.
Or you know what? If you are completely going off of real life events, first of all, thank you for putting that out there, I guess.
Yeah.
But good for you.
Yes. Anyway, we have talked a lot about all of this. Let's do Rec Corner! First of the season, Rec Corner. Oh my god, that's crazy. Okay, okay. So, my rec for this episode is not AYN, but it is very good. It's called Those Who Speak with Wild Beasts by magisterpavus, and it is a fic on, well, okay, let me just it's a fic of the Captive Prince fandom. So if you haven't read Captive Prince, you should read that book series. It's very good. The summary is: after his mother's death, 17-year-old Prince Laurent Aver is sent to the neighboring kingdom of Akylos to wed the crown prince Damianos and forge a bond of peace between the two countries. But his uncle, the ambassador to Akylos, has other ideas. When Laurent's closest friend Aymeric betrays and impersonates him, Laurent finds himself forced to hide his identity and rely on the gift his mother gave him, the ability to speak to animals, in order to survive in the frightening new world of Akylos and reclaim his crown, aka The Goose Girl AU, based off of the Grimm's fairy tale and the book by Shannon Hale. It's 104,000 words, so if you're into something that's really long, and you've read the books, high recommend. It's very sweet, and Damon's characterization is very cute. Damianos' characterization is very cute. So uh, definitely go read that if you want.
So my rec, also not reader insert self insert or your name or any of the above. Again, we really don't read this, guys.
We
So
don't.
we need you to write in and tell us about it so that we can actually give you good recs or at least direct you to people with excellent taste.
Yes,
As we all
please.
know you do listening to this show. Uh, but mine is going to be Jen because there's never not enough Jen. It is a fic called A Way Things Should Be by LullabyKnell. This is a Hobbit fic. And before you get excited, it follows the plot. I'm not going to call it canon compliant, but it follows the plot. And the premise is, what if hobbits had a secret language that they, I don't want to say talk because it's almost more of like a system of body language, but they sort of speak it as part of their culture and customs. And then he meets the dwarves who definitely don't speak it. Um, it is hilarious and sweet and sad. It is about human connection and communication and what really matters. Completely Jen. So if you need something that's just going to make you be kind of smile and just a little bit sad, this is the one for you. So we also have a guest rec because we felt really bad leaving you high and dry without anything resembling a self-insert fic. So this is called Sick as a Dog by TaelonSamada, and it is both a self-insert and not a self-insert. It is from a series of, it's audio fiction. I'm not sure the best way to classify it. I believe technically it's ASMR, but you could consider it a podcast because there is narrative to it. So the series itself has the listener, literally you, the person listening to the audio fiction, as a character in every episode.
Best.
And so when you're writing fic about it, it is per force reader insert because the characters you're writing about include you, the audience member. So take it away, Em.
The summary of this fic is: Darlin is struck down by a severe illness, leaving them weak, exhausted, delirious, and helpless in their own home. Sam comes by to check on them and comfort them in their moment of vulnerability. At least, they think it's Sam. What a fun, mysterious little
Mhm.
summary. I love it.
And for those of you confused about who Darlin is, every episode of this audio fiction, the audience member is referred to as something slightly different. And in this particular part of the narrative, they are being called Darlin. So sometimes people in this fandom will just use that as their name, even though technically it is you, the listener. So
Yep.
this is Schrodinger's self-insert right here, guys. Have
Truly.
fun with that.
Is it you? Is it not you? Who knows?
Is it the you that was listening to the fiction, but not you who's reading the fic?
Is it you because you're reading the fic, or is it because you're not reading the fic? I don't know.
There's so many
Anyway,
questions.
I think we're done.
Yes, almost. We need to talk about fic club.
Oh, yes, we need to talk about Fic Club. So, for this season's Fic Club, we are going to have you guys read 3 fics. I know that sounds like a lot, but you'll have the entire season to read all of them and send us your opinions at mmbpresents@gmail.com. The 3 fics are going to be Garden or Graveyard by ShanaStoryteller, Say It With Mushrooms by FoxDragon, and Sweet and Simple Things by Allecto. So, please read them. They are all adorable. We realize that they all have something to do with food and being taken care of, which is very sweet. So definitely read them because you're gonna fall into a pile of goo. They're just so cute. And then send us your opinions and jokes and analyses to mbpresents@gmail.com. Thank you guys so much for listening, but I think we're done for this episode.
Yeah, so I guess we'll see y'all next week on
Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!